Hello, fellow geeks and nerds. It is I, Daniel. You may call me the pop culture dude. I know it's been like a couple of weeks, or supposedly over a month, ever since I posted on this channel, just because I've been focusing on the main one and been focusing on other projects. And now I'm filming in a different room right now, just of course for the remodeling for the old room. But technically, I'm about to do my spoiler review for Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker, and for this day, just to make this review differently, I am going to be inviting my guests. If you have been following my plus channel, Wayne Daffy Duck, and if you know this channel, The Bloopers 84, I have none other than meet my guest, Gabriel, with this review.
Yes, I'm Gabriel. I just got out of a coma.
Is it the one that Finn eventually got from a coma, eventually fall off during hyperdrive in The Last Jedi?
Yes.
Okay, that pretty much explains a lot. So, anyway, I haven't done a movie review ever since my Joker one, which was non-spoiler. The reason why it was non-spoiler, just because it came out opening weekend. But since The Rise of Skywalker's been out for like almost 2 weeks by now, and like I said, it's one of those movies that it's so hard to not talk about without spoiling. So, another way, I'm like, there's no other way that I can not talk about this movie without spoilers. So, you have to be warned. If you have not seen Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker, spoiler warning. If you are a fan, if you follow Star Wars, if you haven't seen it yet, then go watch the movie right now, or recap, of course, the Star Wars movie on your Star Wars DVD collection or your Disney movies. But if
you haven't seen the movie, don't watch this video.
Yeah, but of course the thing is, if you're not a Star Wars fan, if you're completely new to it and you're planning to go see this movie, then skip. And if you are interested, then maybe you should go back and watch the previous films. But if not, then just skip this film. But other than that, spoiler warnings, you have been warned. But first off, before out of all the reviews and after all by saying like, oh, Disney just ruined Star Wars, they're just ruining my childhood, this is not how I can read it, George Lucas is rolling in his grave, da 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 da. But of course the thing is, like, first off, of course I definitely understand that this fan base is pretty toxic when it comes to like fan services, basically like
a lot of fan bases for like Sonic, for instance.
Yeah, exactly.
And very toxic fan base.
Yeah,
Star Wars, very toxic fan base.
It's kind of like they can't be appreciated.
And then there's the whole Marvel and DC clash.
Yeah, there's so many debates, and that's why there's going to be so much, of course, fan backlash and dislikes or everything. And that's why, even though The Force Awakens was basically supposed to be the biggest comeback to the franchise, but like I said, even though it's not what the old Star Wars fans want, but could you at least be appreciated that your franchise is being brought back to the big screen, but also respect for new generations? And of course, they still keep you nostalgic now, as they keep you back in your day from the original trilogies, from Luke to Leia to Han Solo. But the Finn, Rey, Poe, and the BB-8s, that's for the new generation. That's why they're trying to like to appeal to.
Yeah, it's not like they have to bring the original characters for like the main story and like do the same thing over again. Like, they're just trying to continue the story, but in a different perspective and different time with different characters. So, I don't know how that's a spit in the face to the originals when it's a continuation of the originals, and then people complain about, oh, they changed this, Rey can't do that, they didn't do that in the other movies, blah, blah, blah. Well, again, this is a continuation of the story that you saw before, so it's still counts, you know?
Yeah, it's still parts in the continuity. Like what I said, why are you taking this so seriously? This is Star Wars, a fantasy in space. We're freaking, of course, Luke is stopped in an X-Wing in just one night. Of course, Han just shot a dude without seeing and looking. Finn holding a lightsaber with no Jedi experience. So that's what I'm saying. Like, this shouldn't be a franchise you take so seriously, especially the intrusion of Jar Binks in the prequels. So, eventually, we came in to see The Rise of Skywalker be by saying, like, oh boy, of course, I wonder how they eventually pull off, since it's supposed to be, like, not just the conclusion to the sequel trilogy, but the conclusion, like, the finale of the entire Skywalker saga. And we know the last two previous Star Wars movies were not pleasing. For The Last Jedi, from its mixed reviews, and also Solo, just because of its box office bomb. So now, we decided I came for this movie just to be at least hopeful about it. And at the end of the day, and yes, I did heard some reviews. Thank you, internet. You're really great, especially for trying to get me caught in the spoilers. But there's been, like, at first, I heard positive screams like, okay, this movie has a possibility to be one of the best. But until then, when I see that rotten score on Rotten Tomatoes at 55%, I'm like, oh, no. They still have not learned the lesson to the pathway to the dark side. So, we came to see this movie, and basically, we liked it.
I loved it personally. I don't know why it got so much hate. Like, and then I remember I saw the rating and it was like a 55. Yeah. And I saw that and I was like, is it that bad? It can't be that bad. This is the finale. And then I kept waiting until the day we watched the movie, and still there was like a mix. It was like there was other people saying this is a good conclusion. Other people was like this ruined Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't know what to believe. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna wait till I watch the movie.
Until I find my own opinion on it, watch the movie myself.
And after watching this movie, I was like, what? Did we watch the same movie or what? Because this was actually pretty good in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I understand why.
I understand the hate of
why
it.
there's hate because of the whole plot twist thing of Palpatine being the grandfather of Rey.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't really, well, I kind of did, but I also didn't, which is why it was just kind of weird, and I didn't see how that worked because it kind of ruined the continuity a bit. But yeah, that and that lesbian couple. I'm sorry, you can call me homophobic, but I just don't agree with it.
It wasn't necessary to show in front of the kiddies.
Yeah, so I say those are the only flaws is like ruining the continuity a bit with the whole Palpatine thing, and that other thing.
Yeah,
but everything other than that, I thought it was good because they resurrected Luke's character again.
They
compared
did.
to the Last Jedi.
From how Ryan Johnson handled it.
Ryan Johnson. Let's pretend you didn't film a Star Wars movie, but yeah, they definitely fixed his character again in this movie, and that made me really happy because he's like, I don't know, I can't say if he's one of my favorites or my most favorite character in the Star Wars movies, but I'm just glad they did that, and it's pretty ironic how he caught the lightsaber and said, you should treat a Jedi's weapon with more respect.
Yeah,
and then the Last Jedi,
he just tossed it. Like in the Last Jedi, I thought like from that. First off, I got chills by the ending of Force Awakens, where it goes like basically when he's like on the island, when of course John Williams' music goes like,
where it's just a beautiful homeless man on an island.
Yeah, basically that's why it explains why Luke was so stranded and no one heard about the last Skywalker.
Yeah, and another thing is that he was on the island because he was scared and he had fear within him. And like Yoda said, fear leads to the dark side.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't good that he was in that situation. And then after saving the Resistance in The Last Jedi, he realized his potential as a Jedi again.
He did.
And he now learned the ways of being one with the Force, and he's Luke again. That's all I can say. He's Luke again.
Exactly. It's the Luke that we know. And to me, like I said, this is why, of course, this is where we, of course, get to, of course, to the spoiler territory. I have to say, the Star Wars Rise of Skywalker is more, well, to me, the Spider-Man 3 of the trilogy. Why do I have to say that? Because, first off, from outside metaphorically, yes, they have mixed reviews, but other than that, they both have a similar story and a very similar theme to it, particularly for our main, of course, protagonist, Rey. And speaking of the characters, first off, I'm so glad that most of the characters, like, of course, this new crew of course, the Star Wars trilogy, from Rey to Finn to Poe to Chewie and C-3PO, I'm so glad that they're all useful and, of course, teaming up together, because that's what I like about the original crew with Luke, Han, Leia, and when they team up with Chewbacca, R2-D2, and C-3PO, they eventually just become, like, a really valuable team where that they work together, like, of course, destroying the Star Killer base, especially, of course, when it happens to Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi. Like, I appreciate that, and to me, that legacy still lives on with these new characters, and that's what I dislike about it. And I like in the beginning was very more pacing than I was before, and the one thing that was really great about this movie, it led me to, like, so much mystery and so many unexpected twists, like, very Empire Strikes Back of the I am your father. Like, so many twists I did not expect. Like, the very beginning, it still surprised me when, of course, we got Kylo Ren, where basically he was finding the Wayfinder, which finds, of course, all the voices of all the other Sith Lords, and that's why he eventually just go inside to underneath this temple, which basically rises. And, of course, the bottom, of course, Death Star. And then one of the things that was really interesting, of course, we hear so many callbacks of the voices. Like, we hear some voices like Snoke and James Earl Jones' Darth Vader, which got me the chills, not gonna lie.
And they played his theme so many times. It was so cool. I really liked that.
Yeah, they put so many callbacks to the scene, especially with the skull of when he eventually have. Because I remember, like, back in Force Awakens, with this nothing will start it our way. I'll finish for what you started. So eventually, one of the things that got me curious, because fun fact, we, of course, before we get to see Rise of Skywalker, we get to watch Return of the Jedi one last time on Disney Plus, because that was Palpatine's last appearance. And that's why, before seeing this movie, I'm like, how did Palpatine survive? Like, that's the one thing that got me very curious.
And I noticed that he was, like, on this machine thing. He was connected to
and his eyes just look so dead, like he's a zombie.
Yeah, he looked like a zombie. He was connected to, like, this machine. His fingers were all crusty and all that. So, I mean, it's cool that they brought that element to him to show that he got damaged through the survival as well. But I was confused with like how he went down there, how he even survived, like how he fell through that and
Exactly.
survived. And I'm confused with like what are those people like that audience that was watching him?
Mm-hmm.
Were those like clones, more clones of Snoke? Because I
Oh,
saw
it
this
must have looked
container
like
full
it.
of
Yeah, like he
Snoke.
says, like I created Snoke, and one of the things, like I'm so glad that one of my theories come from. Like, what if Snoke is basically like an apprentice, like of course
He was more
connected to
like
Palpatine?
he was more like a vessel of Palpatine, connected to Palpatine because he was created by Palpatine.
Yeah, technically. So basically, when I thought about it, when first they kill off Snoke in the Last Jedi, to me that's when, of course, when we, of course, they unleashes like Palpatine's presence like around with most of the characters in the entire story. And to me, that's how it happened. So technically, like one of the things that was very surprising were, of course, when he tells Kylo Ren to kill, of course, the little girl, and she's not expected from what you think. And the one thing that, of course, got me into mystery, I'm like, she's, of course, by saying like Kylo Ren decided like asking a couple of questions. Until then, it was completely unanswered. And then it comes to the shadow. I mean, that's one of J.J. Abrams' essence that he likes to put like unanswered questions to keep them playing in the mystery, and that's kind of like pretty much the theme throughout the entire movie. And I kind of like a couple of Easter eggs and callbacks that I like for an instance, when from my very first trailer reaction to the Rise of Skywalker during that D23 Expo, I remember that I stated like when Rey, Finn, Poe, Chewie, and R2, no, C3PO eventually went to this, of course, plaza that's kind of like a Thor Ragnarok that's like smoke all around, and they kind of like has an Indian heritage with these Muppet looking aliens. And one of the things that C3PO eventually is talk about celebration, like this celebration has always happened for every 42 years. And I'm like, wait a minute, 42 years. And of course, if you minus that away, that's how old Star Wars is when it first started in 1977. And like I said, there's so many other callbacks that I did like. Of course, the music theme songs from in the Imperial March of
They brought back like a lot of themes from the originals, like even from the Last Jedi when they won the fight basically, and I love that theme.
Yeah, I sure did. And like
And a lot of Darth Vader's theme when they mentioned like stuff with Palpatine and all that, and it was really cool. I really like that.
yeah, it really was cool. And of course, same thing, of course, that's what I like about John Williams. So, I mean, come on. John Williams has been, of course, the main, of course, music composers that's been part of our childhoods, from, of course, Star Wars, Jurassic Park, Indiana Jones, Jaws, and E.T., and, of course, Home Alone, all those movies. And sadly, The Rise of Skywalker is his last music, but honestly, he definitely plays a lot of course, homage to it. Because, like we said, one of my favorite moments when we were talking about that scene with Luke and Rey, eventually, I'm so glad, like, when we were rewatching Empire Strikes Back before we saw The Rise of Skywalker, I'm so glad that finally Luke has, of course, the power to use the Force to lift up the X-Wing, of course, from the abandoned underneath the underwater, because that's what he failed to do when Yoda eventually did it. And they did the callback of that theme. And to me, I was just really happy about that. And speaking of the other original characters, first off, of course, rest in peace, Carrie Fisher, but I like what they handle, of course, with Leia in the film. And to me, it's pretty amazing from, of course, JJ have like the privilege to use unused footage of her and Force Awakens and a little bit of The Last Jedi as well. And to me, kind of like what they did with Mr. Potato Head's voice in Toy Story 4, the lines and, of course, a couple of scenes just definitely like a lot of make sense for the film. But the one of the things I did not, of course, really expect from, even though I kind of predicted this, but it was something that was so unexpected. And the fact that in the very beginning, of course, when Ben is eventually on the track to Rey, because in The Last Jedi, that's why their forces feel so in the tingle. That's where we got the Ben swallow meme. And eventually, of course, since we, of course, Rey and Kylo Ren are once really connected, since, of course, Kylo Ren is obviously the son of Han Solo and, of course, Leia. And even though, of course, Luke Skywalker is, of course, the last living Jedi that eventually just leave the path of the Force and be shared into, of course, Rey as well. But the one thing that was really surprising is, like, once, of course, after when they managed to escape by these flying stormtroopers, I'm like, they fly now. And the one thing what I recognize about these stormtroopers, like the flying one and the Sith stormtroopers, I hated that they market these, of course, stormtroopers so much, like in the posters, TV interviews, the Funko Pops, the action figures, but they barely have that much screen time. Be like, well, because obviously for more toy sales. But other than that, one of the things where, of course, Chewie was eventually caught hostage was because we see one of the TIE fighters was eventually flying down to Kylo Ren. Like, if you've seen it from the very first teaser back in April 2019, and that's where, of course, Rey just starts running in, and of course, the lightsaber eventually does, of course, a backflip. But the one
I had
thing,
a feeling she was gonna try and slice the
TIE fighter,
yeah,
and
not just jump over it.
I was expecting something like that too. But eventually, when they were mistaken by a giant pod, was of course where Chewie was eventually hostage. Of course, I'm like, oh great, this is giving me Last Jedi vibes, where Rey and Kylo Ren are fighting over the lightsabers. Eventually, just trying to voice it like, no, it's mine, no, it's mine, no, it's mine. And eventually, of course, the lightsaber would usually almost eventually break by that time. And then eventually, one of the things that just made my jaw drop, I'm like, no, she did not. Like, in that pod, from that ship, of course, we assume that Chewbacca was eventually stuck in. But once when Rey and Kylo Ren were pulling the forces together, and eventually we see electricity coming out. After that, when it exploded, I'm like, holy crap. I'm like, see, this is the problems that I had from the second trailer. I'm like, oh boy, you better not kill another classic character. I get it. Like, what Kylo Ren said is a metaphor, like, let the past die, kill it. And literally, this trilogy is literally killing the past, where they kill off Han and kill off Luke. And of course, like we said, well, we will get to the next character, but surprise, surprise, Chewbacca eventually survived, and that's why it was up to...
Yeah. At first, when I was seeing that scene, I knew something was going to happen to Chewie, because he was going the opposite direction of where Rey was going. I was like, oh boy, something's going to happen. And then I saw the Knights of Ren, I was like, yep, saw that coming. Then he got captured, and at first I thought, like, I had a feeling he was going to die, but I thought they were gonna like shoot him or something like that, but instead the ship blew up, and I saw that, and my heart was racing. I was like, did that just happen? And then I don't know how he escaped, but I'm guessing they just flew out of that ship before it blew up.
Yeah, and
that's what I think. One. And then I saw him again. I was like, oh
thank gosh. I was like, oh boy, I was about to have a heart attack and about to leave the theater for a second. Even though I did leave the theater once just because I had to go pee. But speaking of that next scene where, of course, when Finn and Poe were on a mission, where eventually, of course, to break Chewie out, and this is where we get to one of the new characters. Like we said, I forgot what's the character's name, but she's played by Kerry Russell, who's basically wearing, like, of course, this metal helmet that's basically in disguise, but she kind of have a connection with Poe Dameron to eventually, just, of course, to, like, find, of course, save Chewie out, when the Knights of Ren and Kylo Ren are eventually just trying to track down Rey. And speaking of Kylo Ren, I'm so glad that they got back the helmet again. I mean, no offense from what he was in Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. I mean, I get that we get to see the more of the human side with Ben Solo, but to me, I think he's a little bit more menacing, a little bit more evil when he puts the helmet on, instead of just being like, oh, of course, like, I always wanted to be a Jedi. Like, you need a teacher. I can show you the way to the Force. I'm like, of course, I seen you.
You need a teacher. I can show you the way.
Yeah, the way to the Force. But still, like, after that, I'm like, why are you complaining so much of being so emo? You look like you're Darth Vader. I think you look better with the helmet back on. And he eventually repaired it after when he braked in The Last Jedi. Heck, even kids in 2015, 2016 were eventually just wearing Kylo Ren masks, like, everywhere for Halloween. I'm like, don't ditch the helmet. That's what makes the character iconic. Look, like, Darth Vader never removed his helmet.
It's funny how a chimpanzee fixed his helmet.
Yeah,
and it looked like Caesar, too.
It did look like Caesar.
CGI.
Yeah, the CGI. And speaking of which, even though Andy Serkis does play, of course, Caesar and, of course, Snoke, even though Snoke did not, of course, have an appearance besides being in a container in his voice. Yeah, we did hear his voice when he eventually just get inside to the Wayfinder. But technically, by that moment, okay, one of the things that we all assumed that C-3PO was going to die, where eventually we go to the small alien, I forgot what his name is, goes like, beep boop bop back, and we basically just made the eyes got a couple of laughter. So one of the moments where they're about to, like, find, of course, the message when Rey eventually finds this dagger, eventually that kind of, like, gets the map of the treasure to, of course, the destroyed Death Star that Palpatine eventually rise. But one of the things that, of course, that we all thought in the trailer, where he's like, when Poe's like, what do you see, 3PO? Taking one last look at my friends. I'm like, wait a minute, is C-3PO gonna die? Like,
yeah, at first I thought he was gonna, like, cut the circuits. The little guy was gonna cut the circuits, and then he gives the message and then shuts down forever. I thought that's what was gonna happen.
I thought it was gonna be like I thought he was gonna be completely shot off. But after that, no offense to me, what kind of ruined the tone for me is basically when they removed it. He, of course, he got reprogrammed, but eventually he just forgot, like, hello, I'm C-3PO, and of course I'm a human type of the cyborg, and you want to be like, oh no, he better not forget the adventures that he had with Luke, with Leia, or Han, or maybe even the adventures of not even, of course, forgetting R2 or being with Anakin, like back in the prequels, but after, sooner or later, when they eventually rescue C-3PO, and eventually when R2, of course, eventually pros, I'm like, okay, good, C-3PO is fat, because I'm like, don't completely brainwash, but like what I said, to me it would have been more emotional if he was like completely shut down and no longer functioning, and of course not like have his memories like wipe out, and then eventually like kind of like in The Empire Strikes Back, when of course when his body limbs were completely destroyed and then Chewie had to like rebuild it. I thought it was going to be something more like that, but instead he's completely shut down. But speaking of which, when Finn and Poe are eventually trying to break in just to free Chewie out, and now we finally get to General Hux, and let's be completely honest, General Hux has been used as a punching bag throughout this trilogy, especially in The Last Jedi, where he eventually, of course, got pulled by the Force by Snoke, and eventually, Poe Dameron was eventually start messing with him and teasing him, and now, out of nowhere, when Finn, Poe, and Chewie were in hostage, Poe is still cracking up some one-liners, where Hux is like, I am the spy, and then eventually I'm like, wait, what? So technically, you've been hiding this all this time, and you, of course, been nearby the Force Order next to Kylo Ren, and you didn't give it to us until now?
Spy for what? Like, what was he trying to do? Because literally all we got was he was a spy, he doesn't like Kylo Ren and wants him to lose, and that just dies. That's it.
Yeah, that's the one thing I get out of my seat and, of course, leave, because one of the stupidest things that he did ask for Finn, like, quick, shoot me in the arm, and then Finn was like, no, you're too stupid, I'm gonna shoot you in the leg instead, and then that was, like, the only scene that I missed out, where eventually he just dies, and then just that's it. I'd be like, okay, well, it was almost a waste of a character than Captain Phasma. So, eventually when we start moving on, where we get to more mind-blowing plot twists, of course, first off, I'm so glad that we get a little bit more, of course, information about Rey's parents. Of course, obviously, in The Last Jedi, of course, Ben eventually just told Rey that there were nobodies, but eventually we get to more origin story where we actually get to see Rey's parents face to face, who are eventually about to get sold, but they eventually got murdered, and that's how eventually that Rey eventually become an orphan, a scavenger, which definitely foreshadows mostly her story in The Force Awakens, which kind of reminds me when Luke's aunt and uncle were eventually killed when he eventually was on the path of becoming the Jedi. And that's why I completely understand, like, why Rey, of course, is going to the same path where Anakin has gone through, and the same path where Luke has gone through, kind of like when Anakin's mother got killed. So it runs the legacy, of course, in the Skywalker saga, and it definitely pays that payoff. And now we get to the mind-blowing twist where Kylo Ren eventually just know for sure, even though his mission was, of course, Palpatine, of course, about to tell, of course, Kylo Ren that she is not the girl for what you expected, is the fact that she is a descendant, like a granddaughter of course, Palpatine. And the one thing is, it blew my mind when I first thought about it. I'm like, wait, how does that make sense? I'm like, since when did Palpatine got a love interest?
Yeah, that's what I mean by ruin the continuity, because in the prequels,
he never had it.
Him having a loved one or anything, so it just didn't make sense.
Yeah, it really did. And like I was about to say, I'm like, wait, so like I said, once the Palpatine had a love interest, and technically, how does that make, of course, the grandfather eventually be, of course, Rey's parents be connected to the Palpatine? I'm like, how does that make sense? I mean, I get it, like, one person just put out a theory online by saying, of course, since Anakin Skywalker never have a genetically biological father, only just a mother, and most people say that he is cursed with Palpatine, since, of course, he was the senator who eventually just take each Anakin and eventually lead into the dark side. And to me, it said it probably might be a similar case, of course, with Rey, who eventually got cursed. And to me, I kind of expected it when she had, like, the electricity that exploded the ship, where he assumed that Chewbacca eventually dies. But first off, that just became out of nowhere. I mean, first off, I needed a little bit more explanation on that, but at the exact same time, be like, I mean, I don't mind her being connected to Palpatine, but how does it make her related? Is it be, like, genetically, or is it be, like, crafted in a lab, kind of like Snoke, or be, of course, I just need more answers. That's what I'm just saying. I was a little bit more confused by that time.
If there was just more of, if it made sense and there was more of an explanation to it, then I wouldn't mind. I would think it would be pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Of a plot twist, but it just didn't make sense or fit. So that's why it was kind of a problem.
Yeah, it really was. But anyway, so besides that, this is why we continue more off to the, like we said, first off, I have to appreciate for the sequel trilogy is, of course, their action sequences from the lightsaber duels that Rey and Kylo Ren, and like I said, from Force Awakens to Last Jedi, and even in this movie, Rey and Kylo Ren brings out like one of the best lightsaber duels that we eventually see on the big screen like ever since.
Now, I wouldn't say it's as great as like Obi-Wan versus Anakin,
Yeah,
but
and Revenge
it
of the
was
Sith.
pretty cool.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. But one of the things that, of course, where Rey was going out of control, that she's like leaving, like almost planning, like she wants to kill Kylo Ren, especially at the final ending of the scene where we got the introduction to this other new character who's possibly connected with Finn, and her name is Jenna, I believe. Where basically that she was, of course, a stormtrooper at a place like Finn, and eventually has more of a connection. And that's like way before we got introduced to that new character. That's where Finn was about to, of course, ask Rey something, but technically he said that he didn't want to say it in front of Poe. And what was Finn about to say? Like, I love you, Rey, or you're already a Palpatine? Like, what was Finn going to ask her? So eventually it leads up to the final battle where eventually Rey was about to find the Sith Wayfinder, and that's where eventually we're going to get to Dark Rey. That's why we have theories like, did Rey turn herself to the dark side? But that's kind of like teasing that she might be. But we all expected that it was going to be a clear vision. And the thing is, I kind of find that pretty interesting because that's kind of like foreshadowing something for what path that she's eventually going to take. Like, of course, you have your light side of yourself versus your dark side of yourself. And then eventually that's, of course, that leads, of course, hate, finger, anger, hate leads to suffering. Kind of like what Yoda says. And basically, when Rey was about to go, oh my God! Oh, well, eventually just tries to kill like Kylo Ren, of
It
course.
reminded me of Luke versus Vader.
Yeah.
When Vader and Palpatine were like, release your hate and all that stuff, and Luke was like, "Ugh." And then he was like, nope, not gonna do that.
Yeah, because of course back then I was almost gonna hate Rey because one of the things I like about Luke, because even though he was going out of control, but he actually sees the good in Vader. But I'm like, wait a minute, Anakin had that attitude, Luke had that attitude, Rey had that attitude. They hold the same blue lightsaber, so I'm like, okay, this definitely makes a lot of sense. Like Luke was almost planning to kill his own father, and now we get to the last part where Finn, of course, about to say Rey, and eventually this amazing battle. I'm like, it was really amazing. And one of the things when I see Water and Rey flipping over, she was acting like Aang from Avatar: The Last Airbender. When I think about it, especially in the beginning where she was like meditating in front of like the training with Leia, I'm like, wow. It's so amazing that Disney can make a better Avatar adaptation on the big screen than M. Night Shyamalan from that crappy movie that we should not speak of. So, other way, like the thing is, like basically, like one thing's like, of course, first off, Kylo, like Ben's, like himself is basically not becoming the real villain. It's Rey who she is, like becoming to the path to the dark side thanks to Palpatine. So basically, like one of the things that Rey and Kylo Ren did both the same mistake. Like basically, if those of you who have watched Force Awakens, you definitely remember that, of course, when Han Solo was confronting to his son and, of course, giving him a second chance, and Ben doesn't want to be cursed in the dark side anymore. But eventually, when the dark side eventually consumed over him, that leads him to killing his own father. And that was the mistake. And he was like so emotionally torn to him. Like eventually, it just like splits him apart. And now it's the exact same thing with Rey. Like technically, when Kylo Ren, of course, when he was caught in the presence of Leia, eventually communicate, he eventually stops fighting. He doesn't want to compete anymore because he hears the voice of his mother. But till then, since Rey did not notice about it, she eventually just stabs Kylo Ren through the lightsaber, and eventually that's how Leia dies. And like we said, Rey did the exact same mistake that Kylo Ren did. And first off, it did blow my mind just because I know people are going to have a lot of hate to this, but like I said, to me, that's like kind of like the theme of the story because there's so many messages. Because first off, even though Kylo Ren and Rey definitely did a big mistake, and yes, it pretty much emotional that, of course, Leia did pass away, of course, obviously for insecurity.
That moment, aside from Chewie's death, was like one of the most emotional parts of the movie because so much was going on. Like Ren just got stabbed, Leia just died, and then we get a part with the vision of Han Solo.
Oh, that made me tear up when I heard say, hey, kid. I'm like, there's only one person that will, of course, call someone kid. And eventually, that's like, to me, that's where I started like tearing up. I mean, Leia's death, of course, that's where it starts tearing, but eventually where I start like having more of sad emotions, basically, where even though it's not a Force ghost, because Han is not a Jedi, it's basically more like in his mind, like in his memory. Just think, if you watch Joker, think about Arthur using his own imagination. That's kind of a similar thing for what Ben when he's looking at Han. And eventually, like, of course, that Ben eventually knows that his mistake, and eventually Han, of course, by saying, like, you're not Kylo Ren, you're Ben Solo, you're my son. And the one thing is, I'm so glad that Ben eventually let go of the dark side of him. He doesn't no longer want to be part of the dark side anymore, and eventually he wants, of course, be more like his father, and it proves that people can change. And that's one of the things I just like about the message. It's like, people can change. No matter where you came from. If you come from the light side, if you come from the dark side, people will only have second chances to become a better improvement of themselves.
Even the message of Star Wars in a whole, because a lot of people have gone through that. Darth Vader, or Anakin, I guess you could say, went to the dark side and changed at the end. So again, the message to like almost this whole saga is that no matter where you come from, no matter how you start off as a person, you can always change for the better.
And that's why they eventually did. And to me, that leads up to, like, in my opinion, one of the most impactful finales ever since the Avengers Endgame final battle. The one thing is, I'm so glad that this movie just literally ended up as a high-flying Star Wars, both on ground and both in the sky. And like I said, I'm so glad this final battle has its Avengers Endgame portal moment where we have, well, not just everyone, but mostly the ships where they play da 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 da, and eventually we got like Lando Calrissian, and then we got Chewbacca eventually in the Millennium Falcon. And to me, it was good to see Lando Calrissian once again. And to me, I never expect him like to save, of course, Finn, Rey. Eventually, they're about to be tracked by the stormtroopers, and I'm so glad you eventually find out because he did disguise himself in Return of the Jedi.
Yeah, Return of the Jedi had something similar to that, so I was like, okay, this has got to be Lando, and then, well, it was.
Yeah, it eventually was, even though he didn't have that much screen time. But of course, he was at least useful for the story as well, from both the beginning and the ending. And of course, since he's a classic Star Wars character, every Star Wars character ever says this, ever since A New Hope. I got a bad feeling about this, and I'm like, trust me, we always have a bad feeling about this when it comes to the world of Star Wars. So technically, I'm so glad that he and Chewie eventually are just riding on the Millennium Falcon again and leaning to it. And that's when eventually we're both Rey. Of course, basically Rey just ignored her friends because she'd rather, of course, attack Palpatine herself because she wants Palpatine out of him. Like I said, it gives me a very Spider-Man 3, of course, vibe into it. Like Peter Parker eventually wants to rip out the symbiote after all the mistakes he did, eventually almost killing Sandman, who was Uncle Ben's killer, eventually, of course, ruining Eddie Brock's John, punching Mary Jane Watson, kind of like a similar thing where Rey, of course, accidentally killed Leia. They eventually become the darker monster side themselves, and they're having their chance to, like, let them go and finally have a set to redemption. And even Ben Swallow eventually, of course, decided, like, go ahead and save Rey. Eventually, when Palpatine, like, when he first interacted with Rey, and first off, I think Palpatine was even more scary and, of course, more, of course, terrifying than I was in the original.
He's, like, technically more HD, or, because it's a new movie.
Yeah.
2019.
It is. And the thing is, I'm kind of like the lightning, of course. I kind of like how, of course, everything that's been set up from the music to the lightning to the dark to the voices. I just like how the way that it's been built up. And then eventually, when, of course, Rey was being a little bit more afraid of Palpatine, he eventually would be like, once when you killed me, all the power of the Sith will be consumed inside of you.
And then it was... one of the greatest moments in that part was when Rey was walking up and she was hesitating to kill him, and then Palpatine was sitting there waiting. He was going, "Do it!"
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I remember, like, I'm so glad, like, so much fan service. They even acknowledged the meme, and we've been waiting so long ever since Revenge of the Sith. He eventually said, like, saying, "Do it!" And eventually, like, when Rey was about thinking about her choice, and when Ben, and the one thing I like what Ben was doing, he was holding Han Solo's gun. I'm like, that's...
And like this, he was, like, doing the whole Han Solo thing.
Yeah, exactly. So, like, father, like son. It's kind of like what Luke said to Rey when eventually she was about to burn the TIE fighter, and eventually she was, like, letting her anger out. It's like, passing on from generation to generation, like, it never goes away. So eventually, I'm so glad that Ben eventually helps out Rey, and eventually, she eventually says, of course, since their force and their minds are between each other when they communicate, they both share each other, like, the same lightsaber for self-defense. And like I said, I think the finale just gets more impactful because once when Finn, Poe, and the rest of the game are fighting all the all the stormtroopers, eventually the ships are about to collapse and explode. Like, Palpatine leases well to the electricity, and the one thing that was amazing about this movie, like, I don't know how this movie's going to end. Are they going to win? Are they going to lose? Who's going to survive? Who's going to not? And like I said, that's how I feel about Avengers Endgame. Like, that's why if I was in the edge of my seat, like, I didn't want the movie to end just because I just get so anxious.
I had a good time throughout the entire movie. There wasn't, besides the flaws that I mentioned, like, I just had a good time watching the movie, and I definitely would watch this over and over again.
Yeah, exactly.
In my opinion, second favorite Star Wars movie.
In my
First favorite, Return of the Jedi.
In my personal and in my opinion, I think it's the best sequel trilogy of Star Wars. Of course, don't get me wrong, I do like Force Awakens, but Force Awakens do have a couple of problems that are unexplained. Like, how did Maz Kanata got Luke's lightsaber when it once fell down during the Empire Strikes Back, where he got the green lightsaber?
Cloud City.
Yeah, in Cloud City, I'm like, since when did she get that? When did Finn know how to use a lightsaber if you have no chance of becoming like training in a Jedi for no apparent reason? And that's one of the reasons why I'm like, yeah. And Force Awakens, like I said, it had a good way to like set up The Last Jedi, but when The Last Jedi delivered it, it did not pay off, of course, what Force Awakens did, because we believe JJ knows how to handle Star Wars better than Rian Johnson. But anyway, like I said, I just really like how this movie ends. And like I said, it really gets to emotional conflict. I'm like, there's so many theories that, of course, I'm like, yep, this is definitely like paying respect to the fan service and the fan theories online. So basically, one of my favorite moments where he eventually, Palpatine pushed like, the last Skywalker. We all thought that.
Hang on. Before we get to this part, I forgot to mention, Rey was using Leia's lightsaber. Because Leia, in the past, trained with Luke.
Yeah, we saw that flashback.
Just like like her brother and her father. So that explains like the whole Force thing in The Last Jedi when she was in outer space and used the Force to go back.
Mm-hmm.
And why she was training Rey in the beginning and why she was called Master by Rey, because she was a Jedi herself. But then she stopped the whole Jedi thing, I think, because of what happened to Ben Solo. And then so I thought that was cool that they made that canon that Leia was a Jedi once.
She did, because Luke did say in Return of the Jedi, where he said, the Force is strong in my family, my father has it, I have it, you and my sister have it. Even back then in Empire Strikes Back, where Obi-Wan assumed that Luke was their last hope, but Yoda says, there is another. So basically, Leia, since she is a Skywalker, that means she is one with the Force.
Now let's get to the good part.
Okay, now let's get to the good part. Speaking of the Force, and speaking of future Jedis, even though I heard rumors that they might have cut this scene while eventually just showing all these Force skills. First off, when Rey was already defeated down and Palpatine was basically, Rise Supreme, if you come to the throne, you become Empress Palpatine. And eventually we hear all these voices of all the previous Jedis, from Mace Windu to, yes, Hayden Christensen, Anakin Skywalker, two versions of Obi-Wan Kenobi, Ian McGregor, and even the original. We even hear Yoda. And surprisingly, we hear Ahsoka Tano from the Clone Wars. I'm like, I never expected
that just proves that it's canon. So if you haven't seen the show, watch it.
Yeah, definitely watch the show, since it's important to the timelines of both Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. And like we said, it's going to come back with a new season on Disney Plus. So that's going to be of course a win for that. More. Yeah, it definitely would explain a lot. And of course, one of the things when Rey eventually got both of the lightsabers, one thing that was so cool when she eventually decided like take down Palpatine, and eventually she says like, I am all the Jedi, because she got all the Jedis. And one of the things, I'm so glad that finally, with that final quote where Luke says, may the Force be with you always. It started with Obi-Wan. And of course, it's like saying like all the Jedis, like of course they will never leave you, and they're all still living inside of you. And that's why it kind of proves like she was unstoppable, which makes, of course, Palpatine fade away. And of course, after that, since Rey used all of her power, she eventually just passed out. And that's eventually we all see Ben die. And like I said, I expected, okay, Reylo moments, have of course your fan fiction and your AMV music videos of Rey.
At first, I didn't. When I saw The Last Jedi, I was like, no, please don't make them a thing. I just don't know how I feel about that. But then, after thinking about it and watching this movie, I was okay with it, and I thought it was pretty cool.
Yeah, since they both come each other by same paths, and of course, eventually, of course, Kylo Ren comes from a dark past, Rey comes from a dark past, so it definitely makes sense.
Because in this movie, it showed more of their connection and how they're alike. So that's why I was like, okay, I think I'm okay with this now.
Yeah, and they both have personal connections to Luke, Leia, and Han, so it definitely makes sense. So, but one of the things that was like so very surprising, like we had our first kiss, but it's also our last one, because
it's a Romeo and Juliet.
It's a Romeo and Juliet story. So basically, where Ben eventually started kissing Rey, he of course used all of her powers, and eventually, just like when Rey eventually heals Ben earlier when she eventually stabbed her, kind of like what Baby Yoda does. But spoiler, Baby Yoda's not in this movie because this is not about him. So basically, like back then, Ben eventually just loses power. He didn't feel so good, kind of like what Olaf is, and kind of like what Spider-Man was in Infinity War. He eventually fade away, and then boom, everyone is saved, and everyone deserves a happy ending. And it's a good thing that everyone have their nice, satisfying conclusions. Like, for instance, when Maz Kanata finally gives Chewie a medal, I'm like, finally, he has it. And of course, I'm like, how come he didn't have one in A New Hope when Leia gave Luke and Han the medal back in A New Hope? Like, that's one of the things, like, wow, it's about 42 years until Chewie finally got that medal. So, eventually, I mean, one of the things that keep us a little bit in mystery is where we have Lando and, of course, the Jaina character who is connected with Finn, basically by saying, like, of course, you know who my father is? And, of course, he eventually detected a mystery. I'm like, why keep it a mystery? Just tell it now, because they look like they could be related. I mean, most of the majority of these Star Wars characters are related to someone, like Rey's connected to Palpatine, and this is where it leads to the ending, and this is where most Star Wars fans get mad, like, oh my gosh, I hate Star Wars now! I kind of like how this movie ends. Like, of course, even though it ended off with Rey and Finn Poe hugging each other, but later then, Rey decided to end up, and yes, I did tear up by watching the ending, where she comes back to Luke's old farmhouse back then, like, back in A New Hope, and she eventually slides down with a small craft, kind of like what she was in The Force Awakens, until then there's this one woman who just asks him, like, who are you? And eventually, of course, that's like early in Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, she has problem finding her identity. But when we see the Force ghosts of Luke and Leia, even though Rey is not genetically a Skywalker, but of course, since we no longer have Luke and Leia bound us, to me, it definitely makes a lot of sense for her to eventually, of course, make, of course, the decision by saying, like, needs to carry on the legacy of the Skywalker, because Luke was the father that Rey never had, and Leia was the mother that, of course, Rey never had. So eventually, when she says Rey Skywalker, and the one thing that was so cool, she decided, like, bury a couple lightsabers, and the one thing, like, huh, a yellow lightsaber? That's pretty new. Okay, it's a good thing that, of course, most of these lightsabers eventually have their own different colors, and I guess Rey has her own force of it. But when she says Rey Skywalker, to me, that's a great final line to say. And in the theater, I'm like, I knew it! Like, back in 2015, I'm like, I knew it. I mean, she could be a Skywalker, or a Kenobi, or could be connected by anyone.
At first, I thought she was a Kenobi because of her accent.
Mm-hmm.
But then, after watching the movie and then The Last Jedi, I was like, you know what, maybe she's a Skywalker.
She could be possible.
And I thought the ending was really good. I think the reason why people complained about the ending is because it was similar to the Return of the Jedi.
Mm-hmm. When everyone celebrated. And yes, even the Ewoks come back, so that was nice.
Yeah, and I understand why people complain about it, that it's, they're copying Return of the Jedi, but it's not really. It feels the same, but it's not really, because it's kind of the same the way it ended, but also not, because it's in its own different way, and everything happened differently. And I thought it was cool that she went back to Luke's home, old home. And
since the beginning.
And when she said that I'm a Skywalker, I thought it was interesting, because that basically, because a lot of people don't like that, and it's like, oh, she's a Skywalker, that's stupid, or I don't know, something like that, and they don't like it just because they like to hate. But I thought it was cool, because basically she's like, think of it this way, she's adopted by the Skywalkers, and she's like, she's taking the Skywalker name to continue the legacy of the Skywalkers, because technically those Skywalkers are extinct.
To continue a generation.
So she's taking that name to continue its legacy, and I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be forgotten. It shouldn't be buried.
Instead of taking the Palpatine name and continuing that, because
nobody
wants that.
Yeah, people would have been afraid for her. I mean, I get it that she was, of course, connected to Palpatine, but if she's a Palpatine, she decided to let that past go, and people would have seen her, of course, she's connected to someone who's part of the dark side, instead of eventually who was path of the Jedi as well. And I like how this music ends, and like I said with John Williams, and I like that the movie ends with the Tatooine sun by the farm, because that was like one of the most iconic shots that Luke was when he was eventually having
the way it started, and that's the way it ended.
Yeah, that's the way it started.
Not only that, the Skywalker saga ended with the last word, Skywalker.
Yeah, the final line is Skywalker, and to me that just made me just clap in the theater. And fun fact, we were
me and him were the only
ones that
clapped.
Me and Gabriel and a couple of friends that we have, we were like the only ones clapping. While most of these guys that were really satisfied, but to me, I'm satisfied from, even though most people said, yes, I agree, of course, Disney's Star Wars trilogy may have been a little bit rushed just because they release it every 2 years, and yes, they do release a Star Wars movie every single year just to, like, be like Marvel, but to me, from all the time that they had, especially for Rise Skywalker, even though I wish it could be extended a little bit longer, like, I wouldn't mind to be a 3-hour movie like Avengers Endgame, but I at least accepted for what they have to conclude at the very end of the Rise of Skywalker. Like, they did some things, of course. I mean, every finale, of course, yeah, they have some, of course, they're wrapped up conclusions, but they do bring out some small, a little bit mystery questions that fans could still speculate. But in the end, it did its best to like wrap up this new sequel trilogy, and it did its best to wrap up the entire saga that's been running for 42 years. And even though the Skywalker saga is 100% done, like no episode 10 or any of that or reboots. So basically, like even though this saga is done, but that doesn't mean Star Wars is not going to be done.
Yeah, they could still do like prequels of like the old Republic, the time before.
Yeah, I heard they're gonna make movies of that.
Yeah, the time before like Palpatine and Anakin and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Like before Episode 1 is what I mean.
Yeah, like we said, I heard they probably might make a movie based on that. But other than that, of course, obviously, I see that Disney's going to take a break with their Star Wars films and eventually
focus on the shows.
Yeah, focus on the shows like Season 2 of Mandalorian, Clone Wars, and we probably might get more movie projects. Like, for instance, Marvel Studio President Kevin Feige, he's a huge Star Wars fan, and he definitely has his opportunity to make his own Star Wars movies. I wouldn't be surprised if there's any Marvel actors being part of that production. But the point is, I'm so glad what Skywalker Saga did its best from what can concluded. And to me, if all the Star Wars fanboys like, oh, this is not the fan I wanted, George Lucas wanted mine, this is not the movie that I wanted ever since 1983, I'll be like, of course, what do you expect Disney to do when they buy the rights to Lucasfilms? Like, you expect them to buy the rights to Lucasfilms and not give you Star Wars movies? What do you expect them to do? Reboot Howard the Duck and Indiana Jones fans? Since, of course, a fifth one's coming out, your time is coming up for fan backlash. But other than that, like I said, I don't really care about the hate that's going on. First off, I'm so glad that, of course, like my history with Star Wars, I haven't become a fan like around second or third grade. But when I heard the release of the new movies, that's why I decided to become more interested about it. And then after that, from Force Awakens, it was a really good audience experience where everyone was cheering and clapping. It felt like a very Avengers audience level. And to me, I haven't felt that experience of Rogue One, Last Jedi, and Solo. But in Rise of Skywalker, most people can complain about, oh, I felt no emotion of the Rise of Skywalker. And I'm like, how? I have multiple emotions watching this movie. I was excited. I was scared. I was, of course, angry. I was sad. I have multiple emotions by this movie. It's like, I never expect a movie. I mean, that's what films are supposed to do for me as an audience, to eventually have multiple emotions and unexpected twists. And I love the filmmaking from, of course, the acting was really good. No offense, it wasn't as cheesy as the prequels. I love the sci-fi effects. John Williams, even though this is his last Star Wars movie, but he definitely does a payoff for making the music, like the music feel cinematic, of course, chilling with a couple of thrills. And I definitely just like overall the story, the set design, the practical effects. And to me, that's what makes Star Wars special in the beginning for the Hollywood industry. Like, it blew everyone's mind of using, of course, a sci-fi movie in space with all these practical effects. And also for Star Wars fans, of course, they become huge toy collectors to, of course, to make that sweet money. But eventually, like I said, for Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker, like, it's definitely a thumbs up for me. I definitely say it's the best out of the sequel trilogy. And since it's his second favorite one, if I have to rank my top 11 Star Wars movies, I'm going to try my best to not to forget. But number 11 is Attack of the Clones. Number 10 is Solo: A Star Wars Story. Number 9 will be Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. Of course, number 8 will eventually be Revenge of the Sith. Number 7 would be Rogue One. Number 6 will be The Last Jedi. Number 5 will be The Force Awakens. 4, The Rise of Skywalker. And then 3 will be Return of the Jedi. 2 will be A New Hope. And number 1 is Empire Strikes Back. And that's my top 11 one. So Rise of Skywalker, I would place it as my 4th favorite Star Wars movie and favorite movie in 2019. Like, I can make a separate video of my top 5 movies of 2019 if you can. How about you?
Top 5 movies of 2019?
No, Star Wars.
Ah, yes. Okay. So I am only going to count Skywalker Saga because I haven't really thought about movies in total. But,
yeah, we're skipping Rogue One and Solo, even though I include that in my list.
Yeah, so, okay, number 1 would be Return of the Jedi. Number 2 would be Rise of Skywalker. Number 3 would be Revenge of the Sith. Number 4 is Force Awakens. Number 5 would be Empire Strikes Back.
I had a feeling.
Then 6, A New Hope. 7 would be Episode 1. After that, I say The Last Jedi. Then Episode 2. And yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty much mostly our review for Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker. So I think it's a good ranking. It's a good ranking. So if you are a Star Wars fan, and of course you're still very conflicted, if you haven't seen the movie yet, please go give it a watch. But if you're not sure about your opinion, then I say go rewatch it before you try to, like, if you miss out anything or have, like, any, of course, spoilers or anything. But other than that, like I said, if you're a Star Wars fan, and of course, technically, if you want to give Star Wars a chance, I say, of course, you come with me and may the force be with you. And eventually, you probably might give a chance for a theater. But if you're not a Star Wars fan, if you're new to Star Wars, then I have to say, go watch from the past, from the prequels to the originals to the couple last 2 sequels in the trilogy.
I advise you start with episode 4.
Yeah, A New Hope, Star Wars Episode 4, where it basically began, then Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, and then go watch the prequels, Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith, and then you can move on to Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, to watch Rise of Skywalker. Solo and Rogue One, they're not part of the Skywalker saga, and I wouldn't say they're really that important to the story, but it's more like an option that you have to take.
Yeah.
So yeah, basically that's pretty much my reviews, and I know this is going to be a pretty long review, and yes, call me lazy if it's not being edited or not, but I just want to give out like my full thoughts, and well, basically our thoughts of Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker, and eventually it's a late spoiler review, and of course, hopefully, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next video, whenever the next movie review, because even though we're already done with 2019, just wait for 2020 for the Sonic the Hedgehog movie, because that's going to be the most anticipated movie of 2020, and if you watch my trailer reaction, you definitely know why I'm excited for that.
Yep. That's going to be one fun time. Not only that, it's the month of my birthday.
Yeah, it's also the month of his birthday.
It'll be a cool birthday gift.
And of course, I will be wearing my Dr. Robotnik costume. He'll be wearing my Sonic costume, and I'll full break down my movie review. Of course, it will be spoilerish because, like we said, it might be a movie that might not talk about spoilers, but that probably might be my next movie review if that's going to happen after this review is being posted. But yeah, other than that, thank you guys for watching. Of course, may the Force be with you. Always.
Adios.
See ya.